Hello, viewers and subscribers. Welcome once again the new screencast, the continuation of the previous screencast. The last screencast I already discussed with you about the possible installation process in Docker and Docker for desktop, and then also the how can you build a Spring Boot application with all the necessary configurations. I mean, how can you configure or how can you build a project structure with the Docker and Docker Compose parts. That's how we discussed the last screencast. Just follow the last screencast, and this screencast will be the continuation of the previous screencast. So if you follow the next screencast from here, so today we try to discuss the real configurations and and the procedure. How can you set all the configuration files in respect to the U project structure, in respect to the U project configurations system process. That means we will define our Docker files, out with these Docker files, and then we will create the Docker images out of our standalone jar files. And that's we already defined our project structure. If you look at it here, so we build the jar files with Maven commands, and then we have the environmental settings files, and then we have a Docker files. That's very simple Docker file. That's the part I will discuss the possibility all of the attribute environmental variables from the Docker files when you write down Docker files. What you need to be think, and what the main part for the core part you need to be really clearly understand what is doing here. How can you configure or quickly write down your Docker files based on your project structure. And then here is the example like Docker compose file. We will discuss a bit more this today about this one, and also the combination of your application.yml files. That's the files. You see a lot of the environmental variable settings here in the environmental files, and then how can you those environmental variables set the environmental variable, how can you pass those variables into different files from the different files like Docker Compose files, YAML files, and also the application YAML files. And also you can also set the environmental variable or arguments. You can set the arguments you can do in the environmental variables into the Docker files, and then also these environmental variable can also be used into the Docker Compose file. Let's have a discuss a little bit more. Today I try to discuss with you to make clear overview how can you systematic and professional way to configure your all the files, and then also the how can you structure your really proper way, how can you structure your projects. It doesn't matter inside the projects, and we will discuss about the more detail about the outside of external configuration. How can you externally configure your deployments, and then you just copy all the files into the from your project structure, put it in one directory, and then from this directory you can run the Docker files, and then maybe you can put it these Docker file the file systems into your deployment teams, and they simply run they simply build a Docker image, and out of the Docker image they simply run the Docker compose and changing the changing the all necessary, how can say all necessary environmental parameters. As I say, you can if you look for these variables, it is exactly the same things. We have it here. So Docker files, that's the same Docker files and Docker compose files, and the environment, and then application.yml files. That means that using installation or your deployment team just need to be changed, and they are where they try to install install the applications, and then they need the application versions, they need the database informations, and then the database host names and database user and password, and which Postgres email they need to be set. These are all environmental global settings, environmental variables that you say defined here, and these the variables are also need to be pass or need to be set to the into the different to the EML file, the configuration file for the application EML file is reading the data, the environmental variable from the environment files, and then also the Docker Compose files, also reading the data from the environment files, and then sometimes we need some data to read the argument variables, and then variables and also environmental variables need to be read from the Docker file into the Docker Compose file. That's the reason I try to make really more detailed discussion for this information, because this is the really most critical part when you are beginners, or even though when you are professionals, then you need to be clearly understand what is doing here, how we can configure the complete application, because in the small company you are responsible from as a full stack developer. So that means you need to be implement, you need to develop, you need to test, you need to deploy the applications into the client machines. It means into the production environment. That's the reason I try to cover with you to how can you from very beginning level to the into the production environments, how can you develop, how can you install, how can you deploy the application from the very beginning level to the end products end levels. That's the reason why I try to discuss with you, to share with you. So go back to the presentation. You see that Docker files mainly containing those environmental variables, form, add, copy, endpoints. I will show you detailed information how when we try to build a Docker files. So that's the information. And then if I go to the second slide, this is the most important part you need to be think about. The if you put it some environmental variables, as I say already said, you same environmental variable into multiple files. That means if you have a like as I say, if you have environmental variable like this, the applications, maybe you have environmental variable application versions, and then you need these environmental variable into the application EML files, or you see that here the active environment, the application names, and then FTP password, and then FTP URL and user, and so on and so forth. And same variables, environmental variables, we need also here. Also, we see the FTP password and user and application versions. That's I mean how it is works, and that's we need you need to be clearly understand. So that's I mean here in the presentation part. If you have the same environmental variables, multiple file system need to be set or need to be passed those environmental variables, and how they if you set this environmental variable, how the precedence or priority will take over, how it is look like. That's the reason this is the part really important part. So if you clearly understand, if you have a Docker Compose files, then the priority will be the really first one priority. So if you have a set environmental variable in the Docker Compose file, then the priority one, and then priority second, it will be the shell environmental variable. That means you define the environmental variable with this Windows in the set command, and also into the Linux or Macs, you can set it like export commands. So that means the priority one is if you set the environmental variable into the Docker Compose file as like here. So you see that there's a maps like Postgres password, we pass the environmental variable that we already set it here. It's exactly the same environmental variables we set here. Application DB name, DB host names, DB usernames, and DB password, database name, and also the Postgres image versions. We use it here 9.6. That's I mean when you define here, this is the take the class priority, And if you don't use the same variable, you put it also these variables, then it's take, even though it will take this the second one. And if you